Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. This is going to be a second tutorial in a video tutorial and audio tutorial series. It's dealing with the creation of a short film animation in Blender and creating music, a musical score to go along with that using some open source audio music creation software packages. This is going to be another video tutorial, so this will be dealing with the Blender side of this animation project. And I wanted to look briefly at this scene right here. So what we're looking at is a star field very similar to the one that we created in the first tutorial. This one, however, has a few more atmospherics to it. You'll notice that there's a kind of a cloud system going on here that we're moving through, and we're also looking at a few light effects. So we see this light that is being generated in space, and it seems to be diminishing, but it is flickering. And we also see some lens kind of lens reflections going on here, some sort of debris on the lens that's being illuminated by that light. So all of this is going to be done in camera. There's actually no color grading or correction or follow-up post-processing on this. This is what you see is what you get. And we're going to look at how to put this together inside of the Blender viewport using some of the techniques that we've already talked about and some of the techniques that we've learned in previous tutorials. But for the purposes of creating this animation of space sorts of scenes and atmospherics. So let's get started here. First we're going to go to our Blender scene. We're going to go to the top view, and we will align the active camera to that view. We'll get rid of our default cube, we'll get rid of our light, and we're going to import an image as a plane like we did before. We're going to bring in our star field that we were dealing with. So we'll use this one. We want to make sure that it's shadeless, and we're using alpha. I believe that's set by default. And we'll import that image. We'll want to set this to texture, and then we'll also want to set our viewport mode, our shading mode, to GLSL. We'll scale this up, and we'll move it back in space quite a bit. And go back to our camera view, and we want to fill out our camera view, but we don't want to enlarge this too much because, again, we don't want our space scene to have stars that are unusually too large or such that we can start to see the artifacts in this photograph that we're using here. The next thing we're going to want is we're going to want another image that is a cloud sort of texture. So let's go here and we'll import another image. And in my library of images that I've downloaded, see if I can find it here. In my library of images that I've downloaded, I have a few smoke images. This one over here has kind of a large field of smoke, and we're going to also import that shadeless. And we'll scale that up to kind of fill out the screen. Now we want to come up with sort of a layered effect where we have stars and then smoke and then stars and then smoke. And we only need a few layers of this. So let's see if we can do that here. We'll go back to our camera view and again scale this up so it fills out the view a little bit better. And then we're going to duplicate our star field. Duplicate that and move it forward so that it's sitting in front of our smoke image, and then we'll duplicate our smoke image and move that forward as well. Now we have some problems with draw order that we need to deal with, but before we do that, we're going to set our materials to work a little bit better. We're going to go over to the Blender game engine, and on our first image, which is sharing the texture and materials with our duplicated one, so if we change it on one, we'll change it on both. We're going to go to the material settings in the game engine, and we'll set this to add blend mode, and then we'll do the same thing for our smoke. We'll set that to add blend mode as well. The next thing that we want to do is on our smoke while we're here is we want to change this to a multiply sort of textured mode. So if we come over here, we can set our blend mode to multiply. And then back in our material color, we're going to change the color to kind of a reddish orangey color, and we're going to turn down the darkness a little bit, make it kind of a brownish color, and that'll be adding into our scene, so it won't be quite as apparent, a little bit darker. Then we're going to go to our star field. On the star field, we're going to click on the Use Shader Nodes, and we're going to open up another window over here, but not that way. We'll open up another window underneath, and we'll set this to the Node Editor. And then in our material slot, we're going to select our star field material, and then we're going to add a couple of color nodes. We'll add a color hue and saturation node. We're going to set the saturation down to 0.5, get some of that bluish color out of there. Then we're going to add another color node. This one's going to be an RGB curve node. And just on the contrast curve, we're going to take the lows down a little bit. And then we're going to bump up the highs just a little bit more to just create some contrast with our stars. If we go to the camera view, you can see again that our draw order has some problems. We're going to disable our smoke fields for a moment, and then in the background we're going to change our horizon color to black, and we will set our display to render the world black background as well as only render. And what we want to do here is we want to alter this so that this looks a little bit cleaner, a little bit better. So right now our colors are a little bit washed out, so let's bring up the darks a little bit more and increase the contrast. Maybe we'll bump this over to the right, bring down our darks. And we'll play around with this until we get the kind of image that we want. And this might work okay for right now. Once we get everything in there, this will look a little bit better. Let's enable our second star field. We'll select it. And you can see that this looks like an enlarged version of the first one. So let's scale this down a little bit. And then we're going to rotate it on the z-axis 180 degrees, so it's an exact replicated exactly the opposite of our replicated one in the background. And then we're going to spin it here on the z-axis just a little bit to get it a little bit off center. Scale it up so that it fills out the camera view. We might even slide it to the left or the right or up or down so that it's just a little bit more offset. We don't want to have a complete mirrored image in our scene, so it's so obvious. And then we'll enable our smoke images as well. Now, we want to get our draw order to read properly. So there's a quick way to do this. This is a trick that we learned in the Hacking the Viewport series that's on this channel. We're going to change the way that Blender reads these images with respect to their time of creation and their placement to the camera. So the way Blender works with draw order is that it wants to first read the materials of the objects that were first created in the scene. And then it reads that against their depth and space. So those images that are closer to the camera should be read first in order to see the transparency properly applied and so on away from the camera. So we want our smoke image out front here to be read in Blender as if it was created first. And then we want the star field to be read as if it was created second, and then the smoke image behind that to be read as if it was created third, and so on. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to add an empty into our scene, and then we're going to use this empty to kind of reformat the draw order. So what we want to do is we're going to just put all of these objects, we're going to parent them to the empty. Then we're going to open up the empty in our tree over here, our view tree, and we're going to select the object that is closest to the camera, which is this smoke 4.001, and we're going to unparent it. Then we're going to go to the next object in line, which would be the star field 0.001, and we're going to unparent that. Then we'll go to the next smoke image, which is smoke 4. We'll unparent that, and then we'll go to the last star field, and we will unparent that. Now, the way Blender will read this is as if each one of these objects was created now in the order that they are seen from the camera. So if we go to the camera view and we select the camera, we can now see everything, including the transparency, properly in the proper draw order. Now, one thing we want to do here is we're going to select our smoke in the front. We're going to spin this on the, rotate it on the Z-axis 180 degrees. Go back to our camera view. We'll maybe turn this a little bit more on the Z-axis, so again it's not a perfect mirror image, and maybe slide it around in space so that it is a little bit offset from the image behind. And now we have, if we go back to our smoke image behind that, let's disable the front one and disable our star field so we can see our smoke image. Maybe we'll enlarge this one a little bit and move it in space. We'll go back to our camera view, enable our other planes, and now we have our scene properly set up. Now we'll want to play around with the colors a little bit. Let's say we want this smoke to be a little bit less obvious. We'll go to one of them, and we will go to the material settings. We'll go back to our Blender internal render engine, and let's say we just darken up the smoke color a little bit, make it a little bit less obvious. We see just a little bit less of it. And we'll go back to the camera view, and let's put a camera move on this. So we'll insert a location rotation. At the first frame, we'll go to frame 250, and we will hit G and move in on the Z-axis. Zoom in quite a bit, and then we'll rotate it maybe on the Z-axis a little bit. And we'll insert another location rotation. And we'll open up the graph editor and hit V for vector. That will make a straight movement. And we can kind of audition this by going back to frame 1 and hitting play. And we can see now that we're moving through space, and we can see kind of an atmospheric effect with these cloud planes as well as the stars. We want to go to our last frame and just make sure that everything looks okay. We'll render one frame of that. We want to turn up our resolution to 100%. Go to our render slot, OpenGL render options, and enable full sample. Render one frame. And this seems to be okay. We might be getting a little bit close to these stars, but we'll leave it alone for right now. Again, you want the stars to never be very large. They should always be very, very small in your field of view so that you don't start to see some of the artifacts of the image that the stars came from. You want them to be very, very small. So we'll go with that for right now. You can tweak that on your own in your own project. Same thing with these other material settings so that you get a nice clean image. Now let's add a light in this. So what we're going to do is we'll hit save here. We'll just save this to the desktop. Let's add a light. We're going to import another image as planes. Now this is an image that comes from a BlendSwap project that I've uploaded to BlendSwap called GL Flares. This is GL Flares 2, and inside that project is a folder that has a number of images that I've created. I created a number of years ago of lens flares. Now these are all original compositions. These are things that I created, and you're more than welcome to use them. So if you go to BlendSwap and download GL Flares 2, there will be a folder with some of these images in there. I'm going to grab this one. It's called Streak 8. It's a lens flare that I created. Again, we want it to be shadeless. Import that. And we're not going to mess around with the draw order on this. We're just going to do one simple thing. We're going to go to the object settings, and we're going to select X-ray. Then we'll go to the game engine settings for the material, and we'll set this one also to add. And we're going to move this back in Z-space so that it's behind everything. Go back to the camera view, and we'll scale it up quite a bit. Make it nice and big. And then we're going to add a constraint to this. We're going to add an object constraint that is copy rotation. We're going to copy the rotation of the camera. So as the camera rotates, our lens flare will copy that rotation pattern as well. On frame number 1, we're going to insert a scale animation key, and then we're going to scale this down in the last frame quite a bit. And we'll insert another scale animation key. And then we're going to, in our scaling, we're going to select the X scale. And over here we're going to hit the plus sign on the right. We're going to add a modifier. We're going to add a noise modifier. And then on the Y scale, we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to add another noise modifier. Now we want these settings to be identical between the X and Y, because that's going to affect the scale on the X and Y axis of our original image. And if we go back to the beginning and we play this, we should see a little tiny bit of a flicker. It's very, very hard to notice it. So let's increase our scaling amount quite a bit. Let's go to the X scale. And here on the amplitude of noise, let's change this to 10. I'm going to make it quite a bit bigger. And the same thing on the Y axis. We'll change it to 10. So now if we go back and we play this back, we'll see a much more noticeable flicker going on. And you can see that this is pretty passable with the lens flare right in the middle of our screen. So as we are zooming in and moving in on our camera move, this light source seems to be diminishing and getting smaller, and you can see this sort of flicker effect playing out. So we'll leave that as that. That's pretty good. Let's go back to the first frame again. We'll select our camera. Let's rotate up here to a view where we can see our camera. We'll turn off only render and world background. Let's go to object, and we're going to hit snap cursor to the selected. So we're going to move our cursor to the camera. We'll go to File, Import, Images as Planes again. And we're going to select this lens grit image that is also part of that GL Flares package on BlendSwap. We want to make sure that it is also set as shadeless, and we'll import that image as planes. And we're going to move the image forward on the Z axis. We'll go back to our camera view, and we're going to scale this so that it kind of sits just outside of our camera view parameters here. Then we're going to take it and we're going to parent it to the camera. Now, if you import this and it's not perfectly aligned in rotation with the camera, you could apply the same object constraint to copy the rotation of the camera. That way it will always be the same rotation. But now that it's parented and it's aligned, it will always move with the camera. Let's go to the game engine settings again, which we're already on, and we're going to set this to an add blend mode as well. And we're going to go to the texture slot, and we will set this to a multiply mix blend mode. Go back to the material, and we're going to set a color. Let's make this kind of a bluish sort of hue. Now, if we select our camera, actually it seems to work out okay, that everything is showing up. If we enable everything here. If you have some trouble with this image getting in the way of our lens flare, you can go to the object settings and hit X-ray, and also hit transparency. And that should make it work properly with everything else as well. So if you do run into some draw order problems, rather than reset the draw order for everything leading right up to the lens grit that we have up here, you can use some of these object settings, the X-ray and transparency settings, to get everything to work well again with each other. But I think we're okay. We'll go back to our camera view, and I think we're all set here. If we play this back from the beginning, we'll see our animation. We have this lens grit is kind of illuminated by our light sources, and we have a pretty passable animation here. So you could render this out. Because there's not a lot of movement, again, we don't need to oversample it, so we won't worry about that right now. A couple of things to point out, though, is that we do want to make sure in our internal render engine here. We want to make sure that we have anti-aliasing set and full sample. We have our resolution turned all the way up to 100%. And one thing that somebody pointed out to me in the comment section is that if you're going to be rendering out AVI JPEG, you probably want to make sure that you have the quality turned up all the way to 100%. The reason being that if you render this out and then you do some post-processing color grading or correction and you re-render it, you'll be decreasing by 10% every time. And over renders, you will be losing quality and resolution. So you want to make sure everything is turned up all the way to make sure that you're not losing out on anything. And there you have it. You can render this out. It would render very, very quickly, as you can see there, and you would have a perfectly good animation with atmospherics in place. And just using very, very simple add blend mode compositing techniques in the viewport, some very basic color grading tools using the node editor, and some pretty simple stuff here, some pretty simple animation. So again, if we play that back, what you see is what you get right from the viewport with atmospherics and a star field and a light source and lens grit and everything. So that's another potential scene for our animation that you can create that builds upon the first scene that we looked at. Probably in the coming tutorials we'll be looking at creating nebula using some very simple similar techniques here, but we're gonna start using some camera projection so that our objects are not so two-dimensional. We'll be adding some camera projection to nebula in the coming tutorials. So I hope you have fun with this, hope you learned something new, and I wish you the best of luck and happy blending.